The wind howls through the ruins of an ancient city. Dust swirls over broken stones, once part of mighty walls that stood against empires. A woman's voice echoes in the silence. Soft, urgent, trembling with something more powerful than fear. She was not a queen, not a prophet by name, yet her words changed the fate of a kingdom. What if I told you that one woman, forgotten by time, stood between destruction and salvation? That when the armies of an empire surrounded the walls of Israel, it wasn't a king, nor a soldier, but a wise, unnamed woman who saved her people from annihilation. The scrolls whisper her story. The desert remembers her footsteps. But few today know the truth of what she did, or the divine wisdom that guided her voice. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. And if stories like this one move your heart, make sure to subscribe. Now let us begin. Imagine walking through the dust of ancient Israel. The sun burns low, casting long shadows over the stones. The air tastes of earth and prophecy. Every step feels like a heartbeat from history itself. The walls of the old city stand tall: Jerusalem, Samaria, Abel Beth-Makkah. Places where heaven once touched earth, and where ordinary people met extraordinary destinies. In those days, kingdoms rose and fell like waves upon the sea. The mighty Assyrians conquered nations with iron and fire. The prophets cried out in the wilderness, warning Israel to turn back to the Lord, but pride had deafened their ears. The sound of war drums echoed from afar, a storm of vengeance closing in. And in one forgotten corner of the land, a small city stood trembling beneath the shadow of a siege. Soldiers lined the walls, exhausted and hopeless. Families hid behind shuttered doors, clutching their children as they prayed for mercy. The air was thick with despair. And then, through the cries of fear, one woman stepped forward. She was not born into royalty, her name never written in gold. But her wisdom was her crown, her faith her armor. The scriptures call her simply a wise woman from the city of Abel Beth-Makkah. When Joab, the ruthless commander of King David's army, came to destroy the city to capture a traitor, it was she who faced him, unarmed, unseen by history's grandeur, yet carrying the weight of divine courage. What makes her story so powerful is not only that she saved her people, but how she did it. She used no sword, no deceit, no manipulation. Only words. Words spoken with divine clarity and courage. Words that pierced through the noise of battle and pride. Can you imagine standing atop those ancient walls, looking down at an army ready to burn your home to the ground? To face men who would rather kill than listen? Yet she stood there, calm, fearless, with the wisdom of heaven flowing through her tongue. She called out to Joab, "Hear, hear. Say, I pray you unto Joab, come near hither, that I may speak with thee." Her voice cut through the chaos. And Joab, known for bloodshed and pride, stopped to listen. The city held its breath. The wind stilled. And in that stillness, the fate of thousands hung upon the words of a single woman. Why does her story matter today? Because her courage reveals something timeless, that divine wisdom often hides in the hearts of the humble. In every age, there are voices, quiet, steady, full of faith, that stand between chaos and redemption. This woman's words remind us that salvation doesn't always come through power or might. Sometimes it comes through understanding, peace, and the still small voice of reason guided by God. And yet, what if her act was more than just bravery? What if it was prophecy? What if her words carried a spiritual pattern, echoing God's eternal truth, that even now speaks to those who seek divine wisdom? The mystery deepens when we realize how rarely she is mentioned in the scriptures, and yet how her actions mirror divine intervention itself. One voice, saving a city. One decision, halting destruction. One act of obedience, changing the course of history. The story of the woman who warned Israel is not just an ancient tale, it is a mirror held up to our own souls. For even today, when nations crumble and hearts grow cold, God still speaks through those who dare to stand for peace, wisdom, and truth. But what if I told you, her words were not her own? What if the voice that spoke from the walls of Abel Beth-Makkah was a whisper of the divine, sent to test the heart of a commander, to spare a city, and to reveal that true power belongs not to those who conquer, but to those who listen? As the desert wind settles over the forgotten ruins, Her story calls out once more, an echo through time, waiting for hearts willing to hear. And that is where our journey begins. The land was weary of blood. Israel stood divided, fragile as pottery cracked by the sun. The reign of King David, though blessed, was marked by war and rebellion. The echoes of Absalom's uprising still haunted the streets of Jerusalem, and though the king sat upon his throne once more, shadows gathered at the edges of his kingdom. Far in the north, beyond the lush valleys of Galilee and the winding Jordan, there lay a city called Abel-Beth-Maachah, a quiet fortress town resting near the borders of ancient Syria. Its walls were thick, its people few, its heart still and faithful. It was a city untouched by the ambitions of kings, until the day treachery sought refuge within its gates. The sun had not yet risen when the rumors began. Whispers carried through the olive groves and market stalls. Sheba has fled north, they said. The son of Bichri, he has called himself king. The name alone chilled the air. Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjaminite, a man of cunning tongue and poisoned pride. When David returned from quelling Absalom's rebellion, Sheba had raised his voice against him, crying out, "We have no part in David, neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel." And the hearts of many wavered. Some followed him, some feared him. He vanished into the north, gathering remnants of rebellion like dry twigs before a storm. He sought sanctuary in Abel-Beth-Maachah, a city known not for war, but for peace, for counsel, for wisdom. The people of Abel-Beth-Maachah had long been known as peacemakers. In times past, elders from across the land would travel there to seek arbitration, to settle disputes without the shedding of blood. Their wisdom was as famous as their humility. Yet now, the same city that had once been a place of counsel would become a target of destruction. For when news reached Joab, David's general, that Sheba had taken refuge there, he set his army marching. Joab, iron-hearted, cold as the edge of his sword. He had already slain Abner, David's former general, in deceit. He had slain Absalom, the king's own son, against orders. Now, with his bloodied hands and iron will, he marched to bring vengeance upon the rebel and anyone who stood in his way. The dust of his army rose like a brown storm. The clatter of shields echoed against the hills. Villages along the way emptied at his passing. Mothers pulled children close, whispering prayers to a sky that seemed too silent. By the time Joab's men reached the northern gates of Abel-Beth-Maachah, the air itself trembled. Trumpets wailed. The sound of siege engines grinding against earth filled the valley. From the city walls, the people looked down in horror. They had offered no rebellion. They had raised no sword. Yet destruction stood before them. Inside the city, fear spread faster than fire. "They've come for Sheba," some said. "Let them take him." But others whispered, "If we give him up, we betray the laws of sanctuary. We betray who we are." The elders gathered in the square. The women wept. And among them stood one woman, her eyes sharp, her voice calm, her heart unshaken. She had seen enough of pride to know its ruin. She had heard the cries of the innocent before. Her hands were aged, her face marked by wisdom, her spirit alive with discernment. Scripture calls her only the wise woman of Abel-Beth-Maachah, but her namelessness gives her story power. She could be any of us. A mother, a daughter, a keeper of truth. That night, as torches flickered along the city walls, she walked alone through the narrow streets. Children clung to their mothers. Men sharpened spears that would never pierce the enemy's ranks. The wise woman paused beside the gate, gazing down at the encamped army below. Fires burned in the valley like eyes watching from hell itself. She whispered a prayer. "Lord of hosts, grant me words when words are all that stand between life and death." And somewhere in the silence, perhaps heaven answered. By dawn, Joab's men began to batter the walls. Stones cracked. Dust poured into the streets. The cries of the defenders mixed with the sound of iron on stone. Abel-Beth-Maachah, the city once known for peace, now echoed with war. The woman could bear it no longer. She climbed the steps to the highest part of the wall, her cloak whipping in the wind, her voice rising above the chaos. "Hear, hear. Say, I pray you unto Joab, come near hither that I may speak with thee." Her words carried over the field like the sound of a trumpet. Soldiers froze. Even Joab, the seasoned warrior, looked up toward the voice. He motioned for silence, curiosity, or perhaps divine restraint, staying his hand. He approached the wall, his armor glinting with dust and blood. "Who are you?" he called out. "I am one of them that are peaceable and faithful in Israel," she answered. "You seek to destroy a city and a mother in Israel. Why will you swallow up the inheritance of the Lord?" Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but it struck Joab harder than a sword. In her words was something ancient, something righteous. For the first time in many battles, Joab hesitated. The soldiers below murmured. The battering stopped. The city fell into stillness, caught between fear and faith. Joab lifted his head and called back, far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy. But a man of Mount Ephraim, Sheba the son of Bichri, has lifted up his hand against the king, even against David. Deliver him only, and I will depart." And in that instant, the woman understood. She turned back toward her people, her heart steady as stone. The solution was harsh, but the alternative was ruin. She gathered the elders and told them Joab's words. The people trembled, torn between law and life. "He is our guest," one cried. "He sought refuge here." But the woman raised her hand. "And if we let him stay, we perish with him. Shall we let one man's rebellion destroy 1,000 innocents?" Silence fell. The truth settled upon them like cold rain. That night, they did what had to be done. And when morning came, a single head was thrown from the wall. The head of Sheba, the son of Bichri. Joab's men took it, confirmed the deed, and withdrew. The siege ended. The city was spared. And somewhere beneath the soft cries of relief, the woman prayed again. This time not for courage, but for forgiveness. Because even when one acts in wisdom, the cost of peace is never without sorrow. Yet the city lived. The people rejoiced. The story spread throughout Israel, that a wise woman had spoken and saved a kingdom. Her name vanished into the sands of time, but her legacy endured. Generations later, she would be remembered as the embodiment of divine wisdom, the kind that does not roar but whispers truth into the storm. The sages of Israel said that wisdom is a tree of life to those who take hold of her. That day she became that tree. She stood rooted when all else trembled. She bore the fruit of peace in a field of war. But as centuries passed, her story faded. Buried under the weight of kings and battles, her voice drowned in the noise of history. Only the faithful still remember that moment when one woman's words turned away wrath and preserved the inheritance of the Lord. And yet, if we listen closely, her voice still echoes through time. It asks us, when your world trembles, when chaos rises at your gates, will you speak with wisdom or with fear? Will you be silent, or will you stand between destruction and deliverance? For wisdom, once spoken in Abel Beth Makkah, still calls to the hearts of those willing to hear. And that is when the true mystery begins to unfold. Night had fallen over Abel Beth Makkah, but peace did not come with it. Though Joab's army had withdrawn and the city stood unbroken, an unease lingered in the air, like smoke that refuses to fade even after the fire has died. The streets were quiet, but hearts were restless. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men who had cheered in relief now sat in silence, haunted by what had been done. The wise woman walked alone through the square, her sandals brushing against the dust still marked with footprints from frightened men. The moonlight fell across her face, revealing both strength and sorrow. Her decision had saved a kingdom, but it had cost her something sacred. Peace within her own soul. Sheba's blood had been spilled because of her word. His head, thrown from the wall, had brought life to thousands. Yet in her dreams, she still heard the dull thud of it striking the earth. The sound followed her, echoing like judgment. Was she right? Or had she merely traded one sin for another? This was the spiritual weight she carried, the invisible burden of divine responsibility. For those chosen by wisdom often bear its sharpest edge. The world calls them saviors, but heaven tests their hearts. That night, she stood upon the same wall where she had faced Joab. The valley below was empty now, but the memory of the army still hung in the air like the scent of iron. A cold wind swept through her cloak as she whispered, "Lord, did I do your will or my own?" The wind answered only with silence. Far away, in Jerusalem, word of her act had already reached King David. He listened quietly as the messenger recounted the tale, the siege, the plea, the woman's courage. When the story ended, the old king bowed his head. "The Lord hath delivered Israel again through the wisdom of his servant," he murmured. But he never sent word to her. No honor, no recognition. Her deed would remain anonymous, her name swallowed by time. For such is the way of divine instruments. They are used not for glory, but for purpose. Days passed, and the people of Abel Beth Makkah tried to return to life. Markets reopened. Children played in the courtyards. Yet beneath the surface, whispers grew. She gave up a man to death. She betrayed sanctuary. She brought peace, but through blood. The wise woman bore it all in silence. Each whisper was a thorn in her heart. Yet she did not defend herself. She knew that truth and wisdom often walk unrecognized through the streets of men. Still, at night, she prayed that God would show her a sign, that her action had been guided by his hand, not her fear. And one night, as she sat near the gate, she saw a stranger approaching through the mist. His robe was travel-worn, his face shadowed beneath his hood. He spoke softly, "Peace be upon this city." The guards hesitated, but she beckoned him closer. "Peace be upon you, traveler. What brings you to a city still healing from war?" The man lifted his eyes, and though his face was lined with age, his gaze was filled with a strange light. "I come seeking wisdom," he said. "They say a woman here spoke words that turned away wrath. I came to hear them myself." The woman smiled faintly. "There is nothing to hear. The words were spoken once, and their echo has faded." The man tilted his head. "Then perhaps I did not come for the echo, but for the heart that formed the words." Something stirred within her, a quiet tremor of the soul. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon. "A servant of the Most High," he said simply. "One who listens for his voice in the mouths of the humble." The woman's eyes softened. "And what have you heard?" The traveler sat beside her and spoke in a voice that seemed to carry both weight and warmth. "That when you spoke, heaven listened. That when Joab stayed his hand, it was not by fear or mercy, but by the Spirit of God that moved through your courage. Do not grieve the price of obedience. For wisdom is a fire, it purifies through pain." Her breath caught. "So it was not my doing?" He smiled. "You were the vessel. The word was his." And in that moment, tears welled in her eyes. The guilt that had coiled around her heart began to unravel. For she realized that her courage was not born from pride or calculation, but from something divine that had chosen her long before she knew it. The traveler rose, brushing the dust from his robe. "The Lord uses the forgotten to guard the living," he said. "You have preserved the inheritance of his people. But know this, the wisdom that spoke through you was not for your city alone. It was for generations yet to come." Before she could speak again, he was gone. The mist swallowed his figure, and the night returned to silence. In the days that followed, she began to see with new eyes. The same walls that once felt like prison stones now felt like altars. The city that had whispered judgment now felt like sacred ground. Still, she wondered about the traveler. Who was he? A prophet? An angel? A messenger in disguise? None could say. But his words had restored her peace, and perhaps that was miracle enough. Years passed. The woman grew older, her hair silver as the desert moon. Children who once feared her now sat at her feet, listening to stories of courage, faith, and the unseen hand of God. And yet, even as age slowed her steps, her heart remained steadfast. She often looked beyond the northern hills and thought of the promise the traveler had spoken. The wisdom was not for your city alone. What did he mean? What purpose still waited? Hidden within those ancient words. One evening, as the sun sank over the hills, she dreamt again. In her dream, she stood once more upon the wall. But this time, the city below was not Abel Beth Makkah. It was a city of stone and smoke, filled with strangers dressed in garments she did not know. The walls were high, the sky crimson with judgment. She heard voices shouting, not in Hebrew, but in tongues foreign to her ear. And then she heard it, the same cry she had once made. Hear, hear. Let me speak to you. But this time no one listened. The walls trembled, and the city fell. She awoke trembling, her heart pounding with dread. Was it a vision? A warning? A glimpse of what was yet to come? She knelt, whispering into the night. Lord, if you still speak through the humble, then speak through me once more. Let your wisdom not be buried with me. Let it rise again when the world needs it most. Outside, the wind rose, a low mournful sound moving through the olive trees. It carried her prayer into the distance, across the valleys and deserts, through time itself. Perhaps it still travels even now, echoing across centuries, waiting for another voice willing to speak when all others are silent. The conflict was never between her and Joab, nor between city and army. It was between pride and obedience, between vengeance and faith, between human will and divine purpose. She had stood in that sacred tension and chosen to listen. And that choice would ripple far beyond her life, beyond her city, beyond her name. For wisdom, once spoken, does not die. It waits, it watches, it warns. And as the last years of her life faded like twilight, the wise woman of Abel Beth Makkah carried that truth in her heart. And somewhere in heaven's silence, perhaps the voice of God whispered once more, softly, lovingly, "Well done, faithful servant." But on earth, the story was far from over. For as centuries passed, her words would resurface in prophecies, in scrolls, in echoes that connected the wisdom of the Old Testament to the spiritual mysteries of the New. And that is when the revelation began to stir. The city of Abel Beth Makkah slept under the breath of time, but the story of its wise woman refused to die. The scrolls might have grown silent, but heaven does not forget the voices that speak its truth. Somewhere between history and eternity, her words became part of a pattern, a divine thread woven into the tapestry of revelation. Centuries later, long after the dust of her city had settled, travelers and prophets would pass through those same northern hills and speak of strange signs. The wells never ran dry, they said. The olive trees near the old wall bore fruit even in drought. And on nights when the moon was full and the wind moved softly through the stones, some claimed they could hear a woman's voice whisper through the air, not in sorrow but in warning. It was said her spirit lingered not as a ghost of the dead, but as a guardian of wisdom. Her voice belonged to the divine order itself, to the eternal memory of obedience and courage. But to understand the depth of her story, one must look beyond the event itself, to the message hidden within. For her words on the wall were not only an appeal for peace, they were a living prophecy. When she said, "I am one of them that are peaceable and faithful in Israel," she spoke more than identification. She declared a pattern that heaven would repeat again and again. Throughout the scriptures, God raises voices of wisdom from unexpected places. From women, from outcasts, from the humble and unseen. Deborah beneath her palm tree, Esther in the king's court, Mary of Nazareth whispering her yes to an angel. Each time, heaven's wisdom entered the world through a heart that trembled, but did not break. The wise woman of Abel Beth Makkah was among the first of that lineage, a prototype of divine wisdom clothed in human form. And so, her legacy became a mystery studied by prophets and mystics alike. Ancient rabbis said that her voice was guided by the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, that moved her lips as she spoke. Christian scholars later saw in her a foreshadowing of Mary, the mother of the Messiah, another woman whose voice would turn away wrath and bring forth salvation. The parallels are hauntingly beautiful. Both faced violence and judgment. Both stood between destruction and deliverance. Both spoke words that changed the course of history. The wise woman's wall and Mary's manger. Two different altars of obedience where divine peace entered through human courage. And perhaps this is the greater truth hidden beneath her story. God does not dwell in the towers of kings, but in the quiet hearts of those who listen. As centuries passed, the ruins of Abel Beth Makkah were buried beneath layers of earth and memory. But even buried stones can speak. In recent times, archaeologists unearthed remnants of the ancient wall. Massive stones, remnants of pottery, weapons from a siege long forgotten. Among the artifacts, one stood out, a small clay seal, inscribed with faint Hebrew letters that translated to belonging to the faithful. No one could prove its owner. No one could name the hand that pressed it. But some scholars whispered, could it have belonged to her? Whether truth or symbol, the message was clear. The faith of one person can preserve an entire generation. Yet beyond the stones, there were signs of something more. In one of the excavated chambers, they found a jar sealed with wax, untouched for millennia. Inside, pieces of parchment, barely legible, carrying words that hinted at prayer. May peace dwell where wisdom once spoke. It was as if the past had left a message for the present, a reminder that divine wisdom never dies. It merely waits to be heard again. And hear it we do, because her story does not end with ancient ruins. It speaks now in our time when walls rise again, not of stone, but of pride, fear, and division. We, too, live in a world surrounded by siege. Cities crumble under hatred. Nations turn upon themselves. And in the noise of war, few dare to speak with the voice of wisdom. The woman's courage becomes our mirror. She reminds us that divine truth still demands a voice. Calm, fearless, steadfast, even when surrounded by chaos. Some say her story reappeared in visions seen by desert hermits during the early centuries of the church. One monk, Abba Theophilus, recorded a dream in which he stood before a great wall shining with light. Upon it stood a woman clothed in linen, holding a lamp that burned without oil. She said to him, "Speak when others fear to speak, for silence can destroy a kingdom." When he awoke, he wrote the words in his journal and titled the entry, "The Voice of Abel Beth Makkah." Generations later, those same words would inspire preachers, prophets, and teachers who believe that wisdom is not bound by time, that it travels like wind from age to age, entering the hearts of those who are willing to listen. And perhaps that is why her voice still whispers through history. Not as a myth, but as a message. For what she did was not simply negotiation. It was spiritual warfare. She disarmed vengeance with peace. She defeated destruction with understanding. She revealed that divine power does not always descend in thunder, but sometimes in a woman's steady voice standing upon a wall. That is the hidden miracle of her story. Not the sparing of a city, but the revelation of God's character through her words. In a world of kings and swords, she became the stillness of heaven. In a world of rage and fire, she became the cool breath of mercy. And when her task was done, she disappeared into silence, as if heaven took her back, her name written not in the scrolls of men, but in the book of life. Some legends say that after Joab departed, she walked into the hills alone and was never seen again. Others believe she continued teaching, guiding her people quietly until her final days. But one story, half legend, half vision, tells that on the night of her death, a light rose from her home, brighter than fire, and hovered above the city walls. It did not fade until dawn. The people called it the lamp of wisdom. Whether miracle or mercy, none could deny the peace that followed. 4 years afterward, Abel Beth Makkah remained untouched by invasion, its fields fertile, its wells full. Perhaps heaven honored the faith of the woman who once stood between death and deliverance. And even now, her legacy lingers in unseen ways, in every heart that chooses reason over rage, forgiveness over vengeance, faith over fear. For wisdom is not a relic of the past. It is a living breath that moves wherever truth is needed. And when the world forgets that truth, heaven stirs again, calling forth new voices in new walls in new generations to speak the same eternal message. That peace is not weakness. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That divine wisdom speaks not to the loud, but to the listening. The wise woman of Abel Beth Makkah spoke once, but her echo has never stopped. It flows through scripture, through prophecy, through time itself, until it reaches us, asking one simple question. When your moment comes, will you speak? And as the centuries rolled onward, her words continued to awaken hearts, until one day, they found their reflection in a far greater story, one that would reshape the entire world. For as her voice once saved Israel from ruin, another woman's voice, centuries later, would bring forth salvation itself. And that is when heaven's pattern was finally revealed. The ruins of Abel Beth Makkah sleep beneath layers of dust and olive roots. But the whispers have not faded. Beneath the soil, where the wind hums low and the stones remember footsteps, something sacred lingers, a resonance from the woman who once spoke and stilled a war. Her voice may have vanished, yet her warning still breathes through the ages. Centuries have passed since the city's walls trembled under Joab's rage. Yet archaeologists who walk those hills today speak of strange echoes at dusk. Sounds like distant wailing, or perhaps prayer carried by the wind. Fragments of pottery bear inscriptions too worn to decipher, but the scholars say one word repeats: wisdom. It's as though the earth itself remembers the woman's plea. Hear, hear. I am one of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. The words that once turned soldiers to silence now rest like a heartbeat beneath the stones. And sometimes, when storms gather, lightning flashes upon the horizon, illuminating the hilltop where Abel once stood, and the locals whisper that it is a divine reminder. For what she did was not merely diplomacy, it was divine intervention cloaked in human courage. She was nameless, yet she bore the spirit of prophecy. Some rabbinic traditions suggest she was from the line of Deborah, another woman of wisdom who judged Israel under the palm tree. Others say she was a widow, strengthened by sorrow, her voice guided by heaven's whisper. But the truest identity of this woman lies not in lineage, it lies in purpose. She was sent to stand between wrath and ruin, to be the voice of reason in a world echoing with steel, to remind Israel, and every soul after, that wisdom is the final defense of the righteous. As generations moved on, Abel Beth Makkah faded from maps. Empires rose and fell, and her story became dust in the margins of scrolls. Yet her warning endured, passed from priest to scribe, whispered in the houses of study. A city that listens to wisdom can save a kingdom. Even today, when scholars unearth relics in northern Israel, they uncover strange alignments. Ancient wells facing east, where prayers once rose with the dawn. Some claim that when you stand there at sunrise, you feel an unexplainable calm, as if a presence watches, quiet but knowing. The air thickens, not with fear, but remembrance. Legends say that one of the city's stones bears a mark shaped like an open eye. No chisel made it. No craftsman planned it. Yet it remains, as though the heavens themselves sealed the city with a reminder. Wisdom sees what anger blinds. And through the ages, the echo of that unseen woman becomes more than a story. She becomes a symbol, a reflection of divine truth hidden in humility. Her act, silencing violence with understanding, mirrors the eternal struggle between impulse and wisdom, chaos and peace. For what if her voice was not just her own? What if it was the echo of the divine itself, the whisper of God through a vessel of courage? Each era has its walls, its armies, its rising tempers. And each era still needs someone to stand upon the ramparts and cry, "Hear! Before destruction comes, listen to wisdom." The mystery deepens when you look beyond the ancient stones. In nearby archives, there are old Aramaic manuscripts describing a lady of the walls, who warned Israel of judgment in a time of rebellion. Some believe it's her. Others think she was an early vision, a prefiguration of wisdom personified, what later scriptures would call the woman who builds her house. The symbol repeats throughout holy text, the woman of discernment who saves life through speech, the one who builds while others destroy. Her story, lost in history, remains alive in spirit, reminding us that divine truth often wears a humble face. Perhaps that is why her name was never written. Because the story was never meant to glorify her, it was meant to glorify wisdom itself. And if you listen carefully, her warning still applies today. The walls may have changed, no longer stone and mortar, but pride and ego. Yet the war remains the same. And somewhere deep within our cities, our homes, our hearts, the same divine whisper asks, will you listen before it's too late? The woman who warned Israel saved more than a city. She preserved the very essence of faith, that peace is not weakness, that wisdom is divine strength, and that the true victory of God's people lies not in destruction, but discernment. So the story does not end. It simply hides, waiting for hearts willing to hear. For somewhere beyond time and memory, her voice still calls through the silence of history. Listen, O Israel, for wisdom cries out at the gates. The night the story reached its unseen climax was not written in the scrolls, but it was etched into the air, into the trembling silence after judgment had been averted. The torches had gone out. The soldiers of Joab had withdrawn. The city had been spared. And in that stillness, beneath a starless sky, the woman of Abel stood alone on the wall, her hands shaking, her breath shallow, as if the weight of heaven itself pressed upon her shoulders. For a brief moment, she felt the gaze of the divine, vast, uncontainable, watching. The same voice that had stirred her heart to speak seemed to linger beside her. It was not victory she felt, but revelation. She realized then that she had not merely saved her city, she had altered the course of divine history. The mystery was not just about a siege or a warning. It was about intercession, about how the voice of one righteous soul can bend the destiny of nations. In that instant, the truth unfolded like lightning across her mind. God had not chosen a king, a prophet, or a warrior for that hour. He had chosen her, a nameless woman, to become his mouthpiece. She was the embodiment of Proverbs come to life. Wisdom cries aloud in the streets, she raises her voice in the public squares. And through her courage, a new understanding of divine purpose was revealed. That sometimes, the salvation of many depends not on power, but perception. Not on the sword, but on the spirit that dares to speak truth amid chaos. That night she walked down from the wall, her garments torn by the wind. She entered her home, simple, cold, untouched by glory, and fell to her knees. She wept, not from fear but awe, the kind of awe that only comes when a human heart glimpses eternity. And in her tears came a whisper, not from the world but from heaven. You have done what kings could not. The woman shuddered. She felt the warmth of unseen hands lifting her spirit. She knew she would be forgotten by men, but remembered by angels. Her name would fade, but her act would echo through every generation that sought peace over pride. That is the true revelation of her story, that divinity often hides in humility. The greatest miracles do not descend in fire or thunder. They arrive in whispers, through those who choose faith over fear. Through her, God revealed that wisdom is not passive. It is not silence. It is the active force that stands between destruction and mercy. It speaks when others flee. It reasons when others rage. It builds bridges where armies see only walls. And perhaps this is the hidden meaning, that she was not only warning Joab or Israel, but every generation that would come after. Her voice carried beyond her century, beyond her people, beyond her walls. It became a divine pattern, the voice of wisdom itself, repeating through prophets, through teachers, through those who cry out even today against the rising tide of human arrogance. When you trace her story through the ages, her echo appears in many forms. In Esther, who risked her life for her people. In Mary, who said, "Let it be unto me according to your word." In every soul who chooses obedience when fear commands silence. And so the revelation strikes like a flash of divine thunder. The woman of Abel was not a mere figure of history. She was a vessel of prophecy, a manifestation of divine truth. Her act was a living parable, a shadow of the eternal wisdom that governs creation. The kingdom she saved was more than Israel. It was the kingdom of discernment, the realm of divine order that stands whenever one heart listens to God's call instead of the clamor of men. And that, perhaps, is why her story still vibrates through time. Because every act of wisdom, every moment of mercy, every quiet word that saves rather than destroys, continues her legacy. In the stillness of modern life, when the noise of pride and politics drowns out reason, her voice rises again. Hear, hear. Listen before it's too late. For in that cry lies the essence of salvation, that divine truth is not found in might, but in understanding. That kingdoms fall when wisdom is ignored. That peace, fragile though it may seem, is the reflection of God's own heart. The woman who warned Israel revealed this. Prophecy is not always thunder and fire. Sometimes, it is a trembling voice standing on a wall, holding back the flood of destruction with nothing but faith. And if we listen, truly listen, we might hear that same whisper within ourselves. The call to become intercessors in a broken world. To speak peace where wrath gathers. To remember that the same divine spirit that moved in her still moves today. Quiet, steady, eternal. So when the winds rise and kingdoms tremble once again, remember her. The unnamed woman who became the voice of God's wisdom. The one who proved that even in the darkest night, heaven still speaks if we dare to listen. The desert wind moves softly now over the ruins of Abel Beth Makkah. What once was a city of fear and fire is now only dust, stone, and silence. Yet, as the sun dips behind the hills, that silence feels alive, as though the earth itself remembers the woman who once stood between chaos and peace. Her story is not about walls or warriors. It is about the eternal rhythm of human pride and divine mercy. The endless circle of warning, rebellion, and redemption. Because what she faced was not just a siege of soldiers, but the siege of human arrogance. The refusal to listen. The blindness that comes when power drowns out wisdom. That is the story of humanity itself. We build cities, we raise kingdoms, we shout over one another. And still, somewhere in the noise, a voice calls out, asking us to listen before it's too late. She became the living reminder that wisdom is not an idea, but a lifeline. That discernment is divine armor, and peace is the highest victory heaven grants. Her courage was not made of stone, it was made of spirit. It was the quiet strength of faith that refused to let fear make the final decision. In every age, that same divine test returns. The names change. The walls change. But the question remains the same. Will we listen to the voice of wisdom, or be consumed by our own pride? Look around today. The kingdoms of this world rise again in fury. Words have become weapons. Pride builds new walls. Technology hums like armies once did, carrying confusion faster than truth can travel. Yet, in the midst of all this noise, that same sacred whisper moves through the hearts of the faithful. Be still. Seek wisdom. Choose peace. Her warning was never meant only for Israel. It was meant for all of us. For the father who must speak reason before anger destroys his home. For the leader who must choose compassion over conquest. For the believer who must pause and pray before judgment falls. Her story teaches us that divine wisdom often hides in unexpected places. In the quiet counsel of a humble soul, in a moment of stillness when all seems lost, in the courage to speak when silence feels safer. It also teaches humility. Because even Joab, the mighty commander, had to stop and listen to a woman whose name history did not record. God often speaks through the voices we least expect, through the hearts the world overlooks. And so, this story becomes a mirror, not of one city, but of the human soul. The wall of Babel is the heart of every person standing between right and wrong, fear and faith. And like her, we too must decide what we will protect, and what we will surrender. The woman who warned Israel left no name, no monument, no temple in her honor. But she left something far greater, an eternal example of divine wisdom in action. Her courage echoes in Scripture as proof that God's Spirit moves in the quietest of hearts, in those who stand for peace when the world demands war. As the centuries pass, her lesson remains unchanged. Faith is not about being known, it's about being faithful. The greatest victory of the righteous is not in defeating enemies, but in preventing destruction. And perhaps that is why God let her remain nameless, because she was never meant to be one person, but a symbol for all who carry the same spirit. The spirit that says, "Before the sword falls, let me speak." So, when you walk through your own battles, when conflict rages around you, when anger tempts you to strike, remember her. Remember the woman who saved a kingdom not with might, but with wisdom. And if ever you find yourself surrounded by chaos, lift your heart toward heaven and whisper her prayer. Simple, ancient, eternal. Lord, let wisdom speak before destruction comes. Because sometimes the most powerful act of faith is simply to listen, and then to speak peace. If this story touched your heart, share it with others who seek truth. Subscribe for more journeys through faith, prophecy, and the divine mysteries hidden within Scripture. And tell me, what do you hear in the woman's warning today? Let's keep her voice alive, a reminder that even in silence, wisdom still speaks.